Our next speaker, Nick Sims, has got an awful lot of operational experience. You know, over 25 years gained in a variety of industries, working, you know, at the front line of business continuity, dealing with a range of incidents. You know, like he will list them off, I'm quite sure, but from DDoS attacks to hurricanes to terrorist threats and incidents. That's the day job. He also sits on the British Standards Committee, which helps put together some of the standards that we use day to day. ISO 22301 you know, being a good example. He's currently working in the London Ambulance Service, trying to help them put together a sensible continuity plan to deal with situations like the 999 service, the systems that support that failing. So a different perspective with some similar themes, I suspect. So, Nick.
Thank you. Keith, of course, has said most of what I wanted to say. But, which way does this go? Downwards? Yeah.
Sideways, actually.
Sorry.
To the right.
Okay. So Andrew asked me to talk about work area recovery and more particularly the alternatives, just so we can bring up some of the things that Keith talked about. But if we take a step back first and look at the required characteristics of a solution, it needs to be value for money. It needs to be credible. In the picture, I've highlighted the top part of Canary. Well, the picture I found highlights the top part of Canary Wharf Tower. And the reason I picked that as the example to talk about credibility was I was consulting for an investment bank who were on the 44th and 46th floors of Canary Wharf Tower, and I got called into a board meeting one day. I just explained to senior managers that in the event of the evacuation of the tower, it was probable that people might die because there wasn't enough capacity on the stairwells to get everyone out alive. And one of the executives called me in and said, I want you to buy executive parachutes for the board. So can you imagine four men, all of whom were between 50 and 60, base jumping from the 46th floor? It's not very credible as a solution, and it was soon the talk of the company, and it wasn't me who spread the story. So we need to think about whether the solution be effective, and Keith talked about some of the challenges. Health and safety, you know, from working at home is one of the examples. We need to know that it's effective. Will it work? Well, if we don't test it, we won't know that. And even if we do test it, we may not know that. Most tests the first time do not work at all, or not satisfactorily. So you've got to keep testing and more testing. So you've got to have a solution that actually is testable at some level. Is it compliant? Health and safety. Is it compliant with legislation, regulations? Is it demonstrable to regulators, to auditors, and indeed to customers? You know, one of the things that we're seeing is more and more customers coming to clients of mine saying, tell me about your business continuity. And don't just tell me, it's no longer tell me. In fact, in many cases, it's prove it. Is it secure? Well, Keith talked about the your 10-year-old hacking your system, but imagine that you're a flat share with a whole bunch of people who work for other companies in the same business, and you're working in the kitchen because there's no space in your bedroom, or you're working in the local coffee shop with people looking over your shoulder. So with that as the background, let's talk about one of the options, which is actually to do nothing. And some people have taken that as a serious option and perhaps thinking of using their insurance to buy at time of disaster. Well, as we saw in some of the events that Keith showed pictures of back in the mists of time, even when there was 20% space availability in London, much of that space was not suitable for anything. It wasn't cable. Today, the space is difficult to find anyway. Can't get it at a price you want, and anyone they won't give you a short-term contract. They'll want you to have a long-term contract. So it may appear cheap, or cost-free, but is it really? Clearly, a do-nothing solution is not very credible at one level. It's also very difficult to test it, because you won't be using the same building after the event that you might test on. Keith also mentioned about cordons and things like that. So if there's no damage to your premises, can you actually claim off insurance? Well, most policies, the answer is no. So I can see people nodding in agreement. So, is that a plan that will work? Well, I doubt it. So one of the things that people used to do was reciprocity. So we agree to use your place, but you can use ours. There was a wonderful cartoon by Alex, and I couldn't find it. I know I've got it in my collection somewhere. And the cartoon was basically two guys talking to each other, one saying, well, if the other company come to us and ask to use the space, we'll tell them we're too busy. But so we've seen people with doing these things in the past, but there are very few organisations now that have empty space. Space is at a premium. You're probably all under pressure to make sure that the space that you have is maximised or got rid of. And really, do you want a major competitor using your building? I mean, because that's most likely people you'll like to have a reciprocal arrangement with. So one of the other options that's similar at some level is displacement, i.e. you'll move your staff from place A to place B. And I was global head of business continuity for one of the banks, and we had a plan that we'd move people from headquarters to one of the other sites in London. Well, we had very clear documentation. There were contracts between the managers in the main site and managers in the other, with penalties for non-conformance and things like that. And even there, that was still difficult to enforce, because every time we wanted to test, we had to kick people out. And also, we ended up with random pockets of space. So, 3 desks here and 4 desks here, so we didn't get the collaboration that Keith talked about as being so important, because the people are all dotted around, because there was one in the old team that had to stay behind and things like that. So storage is quite often a problem in those situations as well, because the filing cabinets and everything else are full. We have also found that morale of staff who are displaced is adversely affected. It's one thing not being asked to go to a recovery site, it's another being kicked out because somebody else is more important than you. So we've seen lots of people try this, and in fact this was a major commercial challenge to the likes of Keith and others for a period. But very few organisations have really made it work and made it work well. One of the challenges that one of my counterparts at this bank had, so I was responsible for global business continuity for one of the divisions, but there were people who had local responsibility for other divisions, and one of the challenges that the person who looked after the UK had was they frequently organised tests, and then when people actually turned up at the building to do the test, found the building had been sold. And that happened 3 times in the space of about 6 months. So the same challenge, or similar challenges around internal work transfer. So at the organisation that wanted me to buy the parachutes, they actually had quite an effective internal work transfer. So what that meant was there were 861 staff in London, and they would transfer the work to the US in the event of a problem here. That was great in theory, and we practiced it every time there was a bank holiday in the US that wasn't a bank holiday in the UK, and vice versa. The only problem was that there were 8 people who settled a particular type of financial product, and that product could not legally be settled in any other country in which that bank operated. So we had to make the assumption that even if 853 people died in the event of losing the Canary Wharf Tower, that 8 specific people survived. Well, that doesn't feel very credible, does it, as a solution? Sorry?
Not if you only got 4 parachutes.
No. Yeah, well, and with the wrong people. Yeah. Also had a situation at this bank where we had a fire in the UPS room overseas, and the plan was to transfer. The overseas centres were paired, so we had pairs across India, Sri Lanka, Philippines, Indonesia. So when we had the fire in India, Sri Lanka tried to take over. They didn't have access to some of the files, so people in Sri Lanka phoned up people in India and said, give me your password. And they promptly were given the passwords so they could keep the business alive. Well, that's not very good from a security point of view. Then we had a problem in Indonesia, so the people in Manila took over. What's the problem there? Well, the problem there was that one part settled French trades and the other settled trades that were done on the London Stock Exchange. Well, the processes for Paris and the processes for London had changed over the years and were no longer similar. So, although in theory the two teams were doing exactly the same work, in practice they couldn't do each other's jobs without some additional training. So, there are plenty of challenges. That's not to say with any of these that you couldn't and shouldn't do them, but they're not as straightforward as you might think. So we've run. Sorry, Dave introduced me as currently working for London Ambulance Service, but I actually am a consultant. Our consultancy called Consulting. We've run many work from home exercises, and there are lots of issues over and above the ones Keith talked about. Capacity, for example. Many organisations have capacity for 20-25% of their staff to work from home. They have no way of prioritising who those people are, and if you can't get through to them, then you can't kick them off the quite difficult to kick them off the systems. So that's one issue. Another is that many people don't have enough ports, or they have or they say when we have a disaster we will add to the number of ports, but once you've added to the number of ports, you're then paying for the licenses for forever after that. So that's not a great idea either. In many of the exercises, we found that people working from home don't normally do so. Their passwords have expired. That's a very common, token. A lot of people have got tokens. You need to change your password after 3 months. So all of a sudden, there's a disaster going on. Help desk is swamped anyway, and now it's got loads of people phoning up saying, "I don't know my password. Can you get it changed?" I was going to mention things like, have you done health and safety assessments? It's probably your responsibility, but Keith got there first. So, but the point is that both of us have recognised that we've seen that over the years as a potential challenge. Again, telephony, key issue. I'm reminded that when I was at this bank, Keith's video reminded me, we didn't have a dog barking. I had my team on the phone, my global team on the phone, because we were responding to Hurricane Sandy. And we were actually, I said, that sounds like a bird. And one of my team said, yeah, my parrot's got out of its cage. So it really does happen. Internal dedicated facility. Well, I've worked in several organisations that have done that. Well, it's very expensive, as Barclays found. But worse than that, what you get is a business as usual creep. Oh, we've got some empty space. Well, we better, wouldn't it be good if we put a project team in there on a temporary basis, maybe get better value for it. All of a sudden that's become a permanent space. It's not available when you need it for testing or anything else. So that happens again and again. And that's where quite often what I've seen, and I saw it a couple of years ago, a large well-known financial organisation, they chose a facility because they couldn't think what else to do with it. It was sort of poor, run down, all the rest. So actually, it's not fit for purpose for using it as a recovery site anyway. The other issue they've now got is the lease is up. So, are they going to renew a lease on a substandard building? No, they're not. They're going to get rid of it. So 2.5 years on, they're going to spend another fortune on kitting out another building. Well, that seems like a great use of money. So going back to Keith and indeed Paul and Andrew, my background. So we used to have mobile trailers, but parking them in London is just not a possibility these days, if it ever was. And going even further back into, I guess you must have had Failsafe Rock as one of your businesses at one point. So Failsafe Rock offered a service to come along and essentially build a building in your car park, a prefab type of thing. Well, again, in London, that's not a very practical solution, and it's certainly not very timely. So having run through the alternatives quickly, I'll just finish with talking about shared work area recovery. And we have a lot of experience because we're independent. We've negotiated with all the vendors. We've done 40 or 50 contracts with third parties for work area recovery over the years. You know what the subscription is, so that's important. It's available quickly. I mean, Andrew will talk, no doubt, about how they can get people up and running in 8 minutes. See, I've learned. You can test it. Indeed, it's in the vendor's interest to encourage you to test. I'm still waiting for a vendor to start charging people extra who don't test, because actually you're putting the vendor is at risk as well. It's a good basis for crisis management. Get the people together face to face. Avoid the what happened in the video. It's got a track record. Keith was talking about the Barclays facility. That was what, 93, 92, 93, and you can make it secure. So it may not be the answer for everything, but it certainly should be, in my view, part of your solution. The one caveat, over 20 years ago I started something called the Campaign for Industry Standards in work area recovery and disaster recovery, and the one caveat is how many times has that subscription been sold and to whom. So you don't want all your neighbours to subscribe to exactly the same facility, because you may all want it at the same time, and how many times has it been sold, because the more times it's been sold, yes, it might lower the price, but the higher the risk that somebody else wants it. So it's really important that you understand what the rules are, whether it's first come, first served, whether it's equitable sharing, i.e. the space will be shared between all those who invoke at the same time, or whether it's something else together. So one of the key questions you need to ask when negotiating with your vendor or with a potential vendor is, how do you manage my risk so that when I invoke, it's actually available for me? So, in conclusion, there are a wide range of potential solutions to put your people, but none of them on their own are the winning answer for most organisations. It's often appropriate to take a mix and match approach, and from my perspective, I will always have some element of work area recovery as part of that. And to finish, there's been quite a lot of research about collaboration. You have to ask yourself why all the really tech companies like Apple, to use Keith's picture, or Facebook, or any of the others, Google, are all building these massive campuses, these massive complexes. If they believe in that technology and working from home, why are they doing that? Because the answer is that their research has shown that people work better together when they can spark off each other. And that is why these tech companies, they haven't gone for work at home solutions, they are going increasingly for getting people back in the office. So that's what I wanted to say. I'll take any questions.
Please do come up, the difficult ones. Thank you, Nick. Some interesting perspectives, and I was struck by, if you like, the list of negatives on the side of some of the things that perhaps we all feel are a key part of our continuity planning. So it'd be interesting to see how those are explored, but with a leaning towards the work area recovery as a viable proposition, provided you can get your staff seats on the chairs when the chips are down. So our next speaker, who's going to have to change his own slides, Andrew Lawton is our host for today, so very grateful to him in two respects: one for making this happen, but two for contributing to the presentations himself. Andrew, again, somebody with an awful lot of experience over the years, I think 15 years experience with some big names, IBM, SunGard, to name but two. And Andrew is the founder of Fortress, and I think he'll perhaps say a little bit more as he goes through his presentation. But he's talked to lots of business continuity professionals who've gone through lots of need to recover their businesses, have seen recovery sites, warts and all, working to one degree or another. Has listened to all of that and has come back with a new proposition, so a man of the future, I guess, in that sense. So what should work area recovery be looking like, today? What is it that businesses really need? How can it work more effectively than the long and distinguished history that it's had? And how can it be made, affordable, I guess? So, Andrew.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Rook. So that was pretty much my presentation. So, just